Sparrow Lake, near Gravenhurst, in Ontario's Muskoka district, August 1954, 20 minutes after the last daylight had gone from the water. Jean Calder, 34, out of Toronto, sat at the end of the dock with her husband's Coleman lantern turned down low beside her, waiting, the way she waited every night of every August at this cottage, for a particular kind of quiet to settle over her 3 children before she let herself begin. She did not open a book. She did not need one. The words had belonged to her since she was 11 years old, learned not from her own mother, but from a counselor at a girls' camp on a lake, not 40 minutes from where she was sitting now, and she had not once, in 23 years, forgotten them. When the quiet finally settled, she started, not as a performance, and not loudly, but the way a person begins something they expect other people to already know. Across the dock, without being told to, her children came in on the second line. It was not the first time 11-year-old Peggy and 8-year-old David had heard this song, and it would not be the last. But what none of them could have explained, not Jean, not her husband Frank stacking driftwood a few feet away, not the children mid-verse, was why this specific set of words, printed in this specific order in a stapled booklet Jean still owned, was also being sung at almost exactly this hour, on docks, and around fire rings on lakes hundreds of kilometers away, by families the Calders had never met and never would. What was it about a handful of songs, passed from a camp counselor to an 11-year-old girl in the early 1930s, and now from that same grown woman to her own children on a different lake, 20 years later, that lets strangers across an entire country sing the same words on the same kind of night, without a single one of them ever being told it was expected of them? The answer starts with an object most of the people who sang from it never thought twice about. A booklet, usually no more than 20 or 30 pages, held together along the spine with 2 or 3 staples, its cover soft with handling by the 3rd or 4th summer. These booklets were not sold in bookstores. They came from specific, documented sources. Organizations like Canadian Girls in Training, a church-affiliated program founded in 1915 that had grown to roughly 40,000 members across 1,100 communities by 1933, and that ran its own affiliated lake camps, including one on Ride Lake near Gravenhurst, not far from where the Calder family now spent their own summers, printed songbooks for exactly this purpose, to be carried into a fire circle, sung from and handed down. Independent publishers did the same. The Cooperative Recreation Service, started in the late 1920s by an Ohio couple named Lynn and Catherine Rohrbaugh, printed and distributed low-cost songbooks and recreation materials to youth organizations and church camps across North America for decades, the kind of stapled, unglamorous print object that a Canadian camp or church group could order by mail and use for a generation. The booklet's job was never to be read by firelight. Nobody could see well enough for that, and nobody tried. Its job was to be learned early, usually by a counselor, or by an older sibling, or by whichever adult in a family had once been a camper, and then to disappear into memory, so that by the time a group actually sat down at a fire, the singing could happen the way it happened on Jean Calder's dock. Someone simply began, and the rest came in without being asked. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the Canadian cottage and campfire summer between 1920 and 1980. What the cabin was, what the campfire or the fishing trip, or, in this case, the songbook, gave the family who kept the ritual, and what they were actually building when they came back to the same lake, summer after summer. Not nostalgia for old photographs, the documented social meaning of a ritual that a generation of Canadian families arranged their year around. A song that a whole dock agreed to sing together, without anyone assigning the parts, gave a family something a television evening never had to offer, a memory built entirely out of voices, with nothing between the people making it. And if you spent your summers singing around a fire like this, or your family did, put it in the comments. If you sang camp or cottage songs as a child, at a family cottage, a church camp, guides, scouts, or CGIT, is there one you can still sing today, start to finish, without ever having seen the songbook again? Next, this channel documents the rented fishing cabins of British Columbia's interior lakes, where families who never owned a single square foot of shoreline built a loyalty to one cabin that outlasted 40 years of summers. Back to the fire. What the booklet demanded, in the end, was not literacy. It demanded memorization, repetition, and someone willing to go first, a specific kind of social labor that had to be renewed by a new starter in every generation, or the whole chain went quiet. Not every song at the fire was sung the same way straight through. Some were rounds, the same melody, started by different voices at staggered intervals, each group holding its own line, while another group began the first line again behind them. It required something most children had never been asked to do before, to keep singing your own words steadily, while a completely different set of words was happening in your other ear, sung by people sitting close enough to touch. Yule. Almost every account of Canadian camp and cottage singing from this period describes the same specific small catastrophe, over and over, in almost the same words. The moment a child, mid-round, loses the thread, goes quiet, laughs, and has to wait for their line to come back around before jumping back in. It was never treated as failure. It was treated, reliably, as the funniest and most bonding moment of the whole song. The fire circle's private, low-stakes proof that everyone present, adult and child alike, was equally capable of losing their place. This is not incidental to what the song was doing. A round cannot be sung by a person who is only performing. It requires real, active listening to the exact voices around you, which is, without anyone naming it that way, a specific and demanding form of paying attention to the people you are with. A family or a cabin group that could hold a round together had done something that looked like play and functioned like practice. Practice at listening to each other closely enough, for just the length of one short song, that nobody's line got lost for long. What did children carry out of that specific kind of shared attention? Precise, brief, and demanded by nothing more serious than a song, that the rest of their ordinary year, structured and supervised as it was, rarely asked of them in quite the same way. Something else happened at these fires that had nothing to do with the words themselves. A melody, sung at exactly this hour, in exactly this air. Wood smoke, damp cedar, the specific mineral smell of a lake after dark, attached itself to those sensory details so completely that decades later, for the people who had been children at these fires, the melody alone could bring the smell back before a single lyric was remembered. This is not a sentimental claim. It is a documented feature of how memory and smell interact, and Canadian cottage and camp oral histories return to it again and again in strikingly similar language. An adult, asked what a specific old camp song means to them now, will describe not the words but the wood smoke, the specific cold of the dock boards through a nightgown, the particular quality of a Muskoka area sky with no city glow to compete with it. The song became less a piece of music than a container for an entire evening. Everything that had happened around it compressed into 3 minutes a person could carry for the rest of their life, and replay, note for note, at will. For a child at one of these fires, this was not something anyone explained in advance. Nobody said, "Learn this, because it will come back to you when you are 60. It happened anyway, without permission, the way certain smells and songs always attach themselves most firmly to the years before a person has learned to guard against forming an attachment at all. What does it mean that an entire generation of Canadian children built some of their most durable adult memories not around an event, but around 3 minutes of melody sung by people who had no idea, at the time, that they were making something permanent? Nobody sat Gene Calder's children down for a formal lesson. Nobody sat the campers at Camp Ride Lake down for one either. The transmission happened sideways, informally, in exactly the way documented oral histories of Canadian camp and cottage life describe again and again. An older camper mouthing the second verse slightly ahead of the group so a younger one could catch it. An older sibling correcting a little brother's garbled version of a line at the family fire without ever framing it as a correction. The songbook existed as a backstop, in a trunk or a camp office drawer, more often referred to than actually opened. The real delivery system was a slightly older child, singing slightly more confidently, close enough to be copied. This is what let the same handful of songs travel a genuinely national distance, without any centralized enforcement. A girl who learned Land of the Silver Birch as an 11-year-old camper at a church-run lake camp in the early 1930s could 20 years and one province away teach it to her own children on a rented dock, using almost exactly the words she had learned, not because anyone had checked her against an official version, but because the song had been transmitted with enough consistency, camp to camp and family to family across the country, that the version she carried and the version a Manitoba or Quebec family carried were recognizably, sometimes word for word, the same song. That is a strange kind of national institution, unfunded, unenforced, run entirely by children teaching slightly younger children, and yet more consistent, coast to coast, than most things Canadian families actually organized on purpose. What kind of national identity gets built this way? Not from a curriculum, not from a broadcast, but from 10-year-olds correcting each other's lyrics at 10,000 separate fires, all without ever comparing notes. None of this repertoire simply appeared. It came from documented, traceable places, even when the songs themselves felt as if they had always existed. Some came through church-affiliated youth organizations, Canadian Girls in Training, founded in 1915 and organized nationally by the late 1920s, ran affiliated summer camps. Ride Lake near Gravenhurst among them, where a specific, church-shaped repertoire of hymns, rounds, and outdoor songs was taught to tens of thousands of girls across the country over several decades. Some came through independent recreation publishers, like the Cooperative Recreation Service in the United States, whose stapled songbooks moved through youth agencies and church camp networks on both sides of the border, one mail-order parcel at a time. And some came through a slower, older channel, folk songs already circulating in Canadian oral tradition, absorbed into camp repertoires, because a counselor or a camp director had simply grown up with them and brought them along. Land of the Silver Birch belongs to this last category. It dates from the 1920s, has no confirmed composer, and became one of the most widely sung pieces in the entire national canon. Used to keep time while paddling a canoe as easily as it was sung in a round at a fire. Its persistence says something specific about how a song becomes canon in a country this size, not through a single official songbook, but through years of use across camps and cottages with no relationship to each other, until a piece of music with no confirmed author had become, in practice, something close to a shared national anthem for a specific kind of Canadian summer evening. What does it mean that a country could build one of its most widely shared cultural experiences, not from a single institution, but from dozens of unconnected church camps, independent publishers, and family cottages, all separately arriving at some of the same songs? Honest documentation requires saying plainly what this repertoire was, and was not. The songbooks that shaped this national sound canon were overwhelmingly English-Canadian in origin and orientation, drawn from Protestant church camp culture, British and American folk song collections, and a specifically settler Canadian imagination of the northern landscape. That imagination borrowed heavily and directly from indigenous imagery, birch bark, wigwams, canoes, a romanticized Indian narrator's voice, without Indigenous authorship, permission, or in most documented cases, meaningful Indigenous involvement in how these songs were written, taught, or performed. Land of the Silver Birch is the clearest documented example. Its verses are sung from the perspective of an Indigenous narrator describing a longing for northern land, and the song has for decades been mistakenly credited to Pauline Johnson, a Six Nations poet, a misattribution that, if anything, reveals how easily this settler-authored romanticization could be mistaken for something it was not. What felt to a child on a 1950s Ontario dock like simple, beautiful nature imagery was, in fact, a specific and well-documented pattern common across mid-century Canadian camp culture. Indigenous people and symbols used as atmospheric decoration in songs, badges, and camp names, written and sung almost entirely by people who were not Indigenous, for children who were, in the overwhelming majority, also not. This channel does not erase that pattern to preserve a warmer story, and it does not use it to dismiss what these fires and these songs genuinely meant to the families who sang around them. Both things are true at once. The songs built real, lasting bonds for the children who learned them, and the repertoire they were built from carried, without much scrutiny at the time, a romanticized appropriation of Indigenous culture that is understood very differently, and much more clearly, today than it was on Gene Calder's dock in 1954. What does it change about how we understand this national songbook tradition to hold both of those facts at once? That it was genuinely meaningful, and that its most iconic song was built on a borrowed identity its singers never questioned. By the early 1960s, a new object had started appearing in the Trunks families packed for the drive up to Muskoka, a transistor radio, small enough to fit in one hand, cheap enough, by then selling for roughly $15, that it was no longer unusual for a family, or even a single teenager, to own one outright. 3 years after that, in August 1963, Philips introduced the compact cassette in Europe. Within a couple of years, portable recorded music had become something a Canadian family could genuinely carry to a cottage, play on demand, and pack away again, without anyone in the group needing to know a single word of a song. Nobody decided in one identifiable moment to stop singing at the fire. What happened instead, on docks and at camps across the country through the later 1960s and into the 1970s, was smaller and slower. A radio, already playing, simply did not get turned off when the fire was lit. A song already recorded did not require someone to start it, or a child to hold their line through a round, or a booklet to be dug out of a trunk. It asked nothing of the people listening to it, which was, depending entirely on how tired the evening had been, sometimes exactly what a family wanted. What it did not do, what no radio, then or since, has ever been built to do, was require 11 people on a dock to agree, without discussion, to make the same sound together at the same time. That specific requirement, small and easy to overlook, had been the entire mechanism by which a stapled booklet turned a scattered group of strangers by age into something that, for the length of one song, worked like a single unit. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the Canadian cottage summer meant to the people who made it their yearly ritual, subscribe. There are more lakes, more campfires, more fishing trips at dawn, and more quiet nights on the dock that were the best part of someone's whole year, and were never described that way at the time because they didn't need to be. A song that a whole dock agreed to sing together, without anyone assigning the parts, gave a family something a television or radio evening never had to offer, a memory built entirely out of voices, with nothing between the people making it. And if you have a memory of a cabin, a campfire, a song, a fishing trip, a sky full of stars over a lake, put it in the comments. If you sang camp or cottage songs as a child, at a family cottage, a church camp, guides, scouts, or CGIT, is there one you can still sing today, start to finish, without ever having seen the songbook again? Next, this channel documents the rented fishing cabins of British Columbia's interior lakes, where families who never owned a single square foot of shoreline built a loyalty to one cabin that outlasted 40 years of summers. The Calder family's cottage on Sparrow Lake got its first transistor radio in 1961. The fire ring on the dock stayed where it had always been. What the radio gave the Calders: music without gathering, someone else's voice instead of their own, entertainment that asked nothing of the listener. What it did not give them: a shared song that only existed because 11 people at a dock in Muskoka had all agreed, without ever discussing it, to sing the same words at the same time. Jean Calder did not know this was what she had been protecting all those summers. She knew it the August her son asked to bring his own radio down to the dock, instead of waiting for someone to start the singing. The songbook had known exactly what to do with a family of strangers by age. No one had thought to tell the radio to ask.